everyone, so today we'll be talking about what is the ventricular system. So over here we have the brain, and the brain is located inside the skull. And the part of the skull that covers the brain is called the cranium. Now when we look very closely, then we can see that in between the brain and the cranium is a few layers. And these layers are called the meninges. And so the three layers are the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. And they kind of like insulate the brain. So if you had just left the brain inside the cranium, then the brain would wobble all around the cranium. So the meninges basically like hold the brain in place. Now, in between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater is what we call the subarachnoid space. And so if I took a cross-section of this place over here, like my orange square over here says, then it'll look like this. So we have the skull over on the top, and the dura mater is the red part. Then we have the arachnoid matter, and the subarachnoid space, and the pia mater. So now you notice something in the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space has these long lines that connects the arachnoid matter to the pia mater. And these resemble the lines of a cobweb. And that's why it's called the arachnoid matter. Arachnoid means related to a spider. So the subarachnoid space is very important because through it, cerebrospinal fluid, it's a type of fluid, it flows through the subarachnoid space. So the cerebrospinal fluid flows through the whole, around the whole brain and the spinal cord, and will come back and will flow, and this is called the cerebrospinal fluid circulation. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid is produced at the ventricles, and they're located in the brain. And all this cerebrospinal fluid is important for insulating the brain too, just like the meninges. It's also important for cushioning the brain. You could think of it like a cushion for the brain. Okay, so now let's look at the ventricles. So the ventricles are, this green one is called the lateral ventricle, and there's two lateral ventricles. Then this red part is called the interventricular foramina, and it connects the lateral ventricles to the yellow part. And the yellow part is the third ventricle. And the third ventricle is connected to this blue part through the cerebral aqueduct. And the dark blue part is the fourth ventricle. So let's explore each of these. So this is the lateral ventricle, and the lateral ventricle is divided into more parts, which are the anterior horn, the body, and the trigone, and which is also called the atrium. And then we also have the posterior horn and the inferior horn. Okay, so now we have the interventricular foramina. So those are the parts of the lateral ventricle. Now we're going to get to the third ventricle. So the interventricular foramina, also called the foramina of Monro, connects the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. And we have the third ventricle then. Okay, so the third ventricle is divided into walls. It's not really divided into parts, but rather in what we call the walls. So the walls are the lateral walls, which are the two walls on each side. Then we have the anterior wall, the posterior wall, and then we have the roof, which is on the top, and the floor, which is on the bottom. Okay, so then the third ventricle is connected to this dark blue part, which is the fourth ventricle, to the cerebral aqueduct. So that's the cerebral aqueduct. And the fourth ventricle, I'm not going to talk about all the parts, but the most important parts instead. So on the back side, you could think of it like the back of this fourth ventricle, since this way is forward and this way is backwards. On the back of the fourth ventricle is the cerebellum. Now, of course, the cerebellum is not as small as this. The cerebellum is actually much bigger. So in this image on the left, on the bottom left, you can see that the cerebellum is here in golden, and it's very giant. It's a giant part. So it's much bigger than this. Okay, so the parts are the obex, then we have the lateral recess, the foramina of Luschka, and the fastigium, and the foramina of Magendie. So the apex connects the fourth ventricle to another part which is below it. I haven't put it here, and that's called the central canal, which leads all the way down to the spinal cord. Then the lateral recess is like these extensions. They like protrude out of the fourth ventricle, and at the front of the lateral recess is the foramina of Luschka, and it's like a pathway that allows it to get back to the subarachnoid space. The foramina of Magendie is also like the foramina of Luschka. So the foramina of Luschka is also called the lateral aperture, and there's two lateral apertures, and the foramina of Magendie is like the medial aperture, and there's only one of it. And the fastigium is the point where it touches with the cerebellum. Okay, so now at the fourth ventricle is a little weird, and that is the roof is actually this part over here, not the top part, but instead this part over here. So the fastigium is like the angle of the roof, or you could think of it like the top point of the roof, and this part is called the floor. That's actually the front side, but it's called the floor. And it's actually shaped like a rhombus, and it's called the rhomboid fossa. Okay, so now you're wondering, where is the cerebrospinal fluid made? And it's made at what we call the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is not actually one part, but it's actually around different parts of the ventricles. So there's choroid plexus at the body and the trigone of the lateral ventricle. There's going to be some in the interventricular foramina and the roof of the third ventricle. Then there's also some at this part of the fourth ventricle. And that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is produced. So let's take a quick review. Okay, cerebrospinal fluid is produced at the lateral ventricle. Now it goes through the interventricular foramina and into the third ventricle. And at the third ventricle's roof, more cerebrospinal fluid is being produced, and all of this cerebrospinal fluid goes straight through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, where more cerebrospinal fluid is produced, and all of this will either go through the central canal. It could go to the foramina of Luschka, where it will get to the subarachnoid space through some cisterns, which are kind of like cavities, or to the foramina of Magendie, which will also get to the subarachnoid space through some other systems, via some other systems. So that's the ventricular system, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and you can click my other videos over here. You can click my hippocampus video over here and my thalamus video over here.